Hey guys, so I wanted to talk about how the skull and how the spine and rib cage develop. All right, so this is the embryology of the skull and the axial skeleton, which is the spine and the rib cage. So I'm going to talk you through the images which you're on the board. We went over this in class, and hopefully this will be helpful for everyone. Let's put this over here. So we're talking about the development of the skull, okay? And it's helpful to kind of zoom in on that trilaminar germ disc, right? So this is something we've been talking about the whole class. Here is kind of the cross-sectional view of that trilaminar germ disc. In blue is ectoderm, in red is mesoderm, in green is endoderm. Here, right in the middle, you have that neural tube. These little purple dots, those represent the neural crest cells, which will go on to produce some really important things like the peripheral nervous system, melanocytes, and all that stuff. We know the neural tube, that's going to develop into the brain and the spinal cord. And we know that mesoderm, well, that's going to develop into bone and muscle and connective tissue and all that good stuff, blood. So, it's worth mentioning now that there's actually two different sections of mesoderm here. Right to the left of the neural tube, right to the left and right beside it, that is the paraxial mesoderm, which is abbreviated PAM. And then just to the side of that, that's where we have the lateral plate mesoderm. Okay, that's going to come in important a little bit later. So now that we've kind of reviewed that, imagine that we're going to look at the neural tube from above. We're going to look at the length of it. We're going to remove the ectoderm and imagine we kind of like look down on the neural tube from the cranial to the caudal end, the head to the caudal end. This is what it looks like. In blue, this is the neural tube. These larger bulges here, that represents the different parts of the developing brain. And then you have the spinal cord, which extends towards the caudal end. Well, on either side of the neural tube, starting down here, like where the spinal cord is going to develop, we have these occipital somites. And these are collections of cells that have developed from that paraxial mesoderm. And what these guys are going to do to make the skull, because that's kind of the first job of the development of the skull and the spine, is we need to encase the developing brain in bone, right? And so what will happen is that we have these neural crest cells, which are these little purple dots, and then we also have these occipital somites. What they're going to do is they're going to migrate anteriorly, right? Or they're going to migrate towards the cranial end, and they're going to basically engulf the entire developing brain, the cranial end of the neural tube, and then those cells are going to develop later into bone. So that's essentially kind of how it all works. You have these occipital somites, which were originally positioned around the more caudal end of the neural tube. They kind of migrate forwards to create the brain or the skull. Now, when we talk about the skull actually is going to exist in two different parts. The first part is called the Condrocranium. This is going to be the bottom of the skull. What this picture right here represents is the view of the skull. Like, imagine we take this miniature little skull. Imagine we take off the top of the head, and what you're looking at is the inside of the skull if this was removed. This hole right here, that represents the foramen magnum, which would be like right there, obviously. And these green lines, they just represent the divisions between the different bones on the bottom of the skull. Because remember, we're kind of like looking down on the bottom of the skull after the top is taken off. Specifically, this is the frontal bone right there. This is the ethmoid. This is the sphenoid. These are the two temporal bones, the occipital bone in the back that contains that foramen magnum. Okay, so that's called the chondrocranium, and this is how it basically develops. Remember all of those occipital somites, the neural crest cells that migrated around the brain? Well, around the developing brain, the ones on the bottom of the developing brain and the neural tube, those are going to then develop into chondrocytes, which produce cartilage. After this cartilage has been produced, then that cartilage is going to calcify or ossify and produce bone, which consists of these cells called osteocytes. Osteocytes are mature bone cells. So really, this is a process called endochondral ossification. And it occurs when you have these cells of the occipital somites from mesoderm, they develop into cartilage. Now remember, cartilage is a really simple kind of tissue. It's pretty much just these chondrocytes, collagen, which is a strong protein, and then water. It's really simple and it's easy for the body to make. So what will happen is that first, these occipital somites produce cartilage, and then that cartilage is slowly converted into bone. This is a really common way in which most of the bones in our body are produced. This goes for like all of the bones of our arms and our legs and our ribs and pretty much most of the bones is that we all have these kind of developmental occipital somites. They produce cartilage. You get this cartilage template that then slowly gets calcified over the course of a human's first 20 years of life. So this is going to happen before birth, and then it continues throughout the development of a person, even through the childhood years, even through the teenage years. By the time a person's in about 20 years old, maybe a little later in males, that transition from cartilage to bone is finally finished. This is kind of a little, animation, a little series of pictures that shows kind of how this works. You get this cartilage template that slowly gets converted to bone, and again, that's called endochondral ossification. So that's going to be in contrast to how the top of the skull is going to develop. So here we have the top of the skull. This is called the neurocranium, and really what you're looking at is the view of the skull right here, right? So this picture, I'm doing too many things at once. This picture right here is this view of the skull. The nose is up top. This is called the intramembranous neurocranium, which is the top of the skull, and it develops in a completely different way. All of those occipital somites that migrated to the dorsal side of the neural tube around the developing brain, those don't develop into cartilage. They develop directly into osteocytes, which produce bone. And this is called intramembranous ossification. And this process basically means that you're going to have these somites that produce bone, and this little area of bone just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as it develops. Now, in a baby, you'll notice that babies have these areas where the bone hasn't completely grown big enough to seal off the brain, right? Called soft spots. Another word for them is called a fontanelle. You have an anterior fontanelle, which is going to be right there where the two parietal bones meet up with the frontal bone. And then you have a posterior fontanelle. That's where the two parietal bones meet up with the occipital bone in the back. And they exist because intramembranous ossification just causes this little small bone to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Not many bones develop this way, but the bones at the top of the skull are a really important example of the ones that do. Alright, so now let's kind of go over here, and now we're going to talk about the bones of the face. Alright, so this is kind of how the bones of the face develop. So we're talking about these bones here in the face. This is called the viscerocranium, and they are going to develop from the branchial arches, specifically branchial arches number 1 and 2. So what's going to happen is that branchial arch number 1, remember this is those little features that exist kind of on the ventral side of the embryo, kind of right beneath the neural tube, beneath the developing brain. And so what's going to happen is they exist, or they consist of all 3 germ layers. Green, you have endoderm. Red, you have mesoderm. And then blue, you have the ectoderm. Well, the red mesoderm that makes up the branchial arches, that's what is going to develop into the major bones of the face. Specifically, we take branchial arch number 1, that is going to develop into the mandible, which is the lower jawbone. It's going to develop into the maxilla, which is the bone of the upper jaw. The zygomatic, which is the bone of the cheek here. And the temporal bone, specifically the lateral, the squamous portion of the temporal bone, which is right out here. Also includes the external acoustic meatus, which is that little hole that is literally your ear canal. Okay. One important thing about how those bones develop, they don't only develop from branchial arch number 1, but they develop through intramembranous ossification, where you do not get this cartilage template. Okay, branchial arch number. So if we continue, with branchial arch number 1, it's also going to help develop the hyoid bone, which is a bone that sits right on top of the larynx. It does not develop into the laryngeal cartilages. I made a mistake there in lecture, so just scratch that. That develops from branchial arch number 4. But branchial arch number 1 does develop into the malleus and the incus, which are the first 2 tiny little ossicles, the tiny little ear bones in the middle ear. Branchial arch number 2 is responsible for developing into the stapes, which is that last ossicle, the last tiny little ear bone of the middle ear. Now, the hyoid, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, they develop according to endochondral ossification. So remember, that means that they do have this template of cartilage. So that's kind of how the face develops. Now, let's look at another image to look at how the spine is able to develop. So this is a different view of something. So now we're looking at kind of the overhead view so this is a cross-sectional view of an embryo after the gut tube has formed. So just to put this into perspective, blue is ectoderm. This is like an embryo at week 6 or 7. You have the neural tube, you have the paraxial mesoderm on either side. This is the notochord right there. You have this lateral plate mesoderm, which has now formed the coelom. The lateral plate mesoderm also engulfs the gut tube, which is right here in green. So what happens is if we focus on this paraxial mesoderm on either side of the neural tube, that's what we've zoomed in on. These somites that make up the paraxial mesoderm, they started to divide and they've created this little space called the somatocoel in this collection of somites that sit lateral to the neural tube. This somatocoel begins to expand more and more, and it divides this collection of somites into 2 different groups. Here on the dorsal side, you have the dermatomyotome, and then the part on the ventral side is the sclerotome. The sclerotome is the part of that these somites that will go on to develop into the bones of the spine and the ribs, whereas the dermatomyotome, those will develop into the dermis and the muscle. If we follow this development, the dermatomyotome is then going to further split into 2 other groups. So now we have the dermatome that forms the dermis, the myotome that forms the muscles of the muscles of that region, and the sclerotome, which will form the bone. Okay, so now let's kind of go over here. What we're looking at is we're looking at a length of the neural tube from the overhead view. Okay, so this would be towards like the cranial end, this would be towards the caudal end. These somites of the sclerotome are going to be arranged in this kind of pattern from this overhead view. You'll notice that there's no break, there's no gap between these somites. That's a problem because the spinal cord is ultimately going to need to develop these spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord. Those allow the spinal cord to communicate with the body so that they can send information to the body from the brain and sensory information from the body up to the brain. Well, during this process of resegmentation, it's exactly what happens. These somites of the sclerotome are going to reorganize, and they're going to create these little spaces between groups of cells. These blue lines, those represent the developing spinal nerves that now have a place to kind of emerge. Now, what will happen is that let's switch kind of views here, and now we're going to look at the cross-sectional view of the neural tube. So this is kind of looking at the cross-sectional view where the cranial end and the caudal end are kind of coming into and out of the screen. These little red regions, those represent that's the somites on either side. And what will happen is these somites, they just start to divide and spread. And the somites are going to spread dorsally to kind of create these projections off to the side. That's ultimately going to become the transverse process of the vertebrae. And it's going to continue to stretch out dorsally to produce the spinous process. So what we're really producing here is the vertebrae, right? So here's literally a thoracic vertebrae. And you'll notice that this is the spinous process that these somites are starting to produce. and this is the transverse process. They also spread ventrally to produce the body of the vertebrae right here. This is where the spinal cord sits, so that's where the neural tube obviously is going to be. Then after it finishes developing that, it's going to start developing ribs that start to grow. So really these bones are produced by these spreading and growing somites. Then these somites are going to convert into cartilage, and then that cartilage is slowly going to be converted into bone. So that's endochondral ossification. Now, let's talk about the sternum, because these ribs are kind of stretching around the whole embryo. So these ribs start here, and they start to stretch. Well, we need to produce the sternum. So right here, you have this section of the lateral plate mesoderm. It's going to produce the sternum. So this little stretch of the lateral plate mesoderm right on the ventral most part of the embryo, it's going to convert into cartilage, and that cartilage converts into bone. That's endochondral ossification of the sternum. After that sternum is produced, the ribs continue going around if they meet up with it. That happens for all the ribs, all 12 sets, and then you've got a rib cage. So that's a quick overview of how that all works. Hopefully that was helpful.